Hello everyone and welcome to this edition of TraderTalk TV. I'm delighted to be joined here in the office today by Pete Wallace, who is GM EMEA of GumGum.
Thanks
Pete, welcome. You're very welcome. Nice to see you at the whiteboard. And today we are going to talk a little bit about a new product that you've developed at GumGum called the Mindset Graph.
Indeed we are.
Just to get us started though, for anyone that might not be familiar with GumGum, just give us a couple of sentences about what you guys do and maybe a little bit of background to the Mindset Graph.
Of course. So GumGum traditionally has been a high impact, rich media supplier, really underpinned by Contextual. And that really is our legacy as a business. Now, over the years, I guess it's the realization that we've had amazing data that sits under the hood of what we do through that contextual capabilities. We also acquired a business called Playground XYZ a number of years ago, which through that acquisition, we were able to incorporate their attention intelligence platform into what we do. And we've always done amazing creative. We are a global business and we've got amazing experience across a vast number of brands throughout the world. And the graph is a data asset that we've been building over the last number of months. And what it really does is it brings together those component parts that I mentioned. So context, attention, creative, and combining them all together by understanding the relationship between them across the open web, across activity we run, in order to deliver on a number of different areas for our clients.
Fantastic. So super relevant in this modern world of marketing where perhaps people, brands and agencies are looking to try to target advertising and marketing messages towards people outside of an ID type of environment, right? So let's get started. Sketch out for me a little bit.
Oh, God, blimey. Here we go.
Yep.
I mean, look, I think first things first, what is a graph? Because, keep this very simple for me because as I was talking about, my drawing is terrible. It's just a representation of data and it's great. It's good for showcasing results on things, but in reality, this is not what we're referring to when we think about a graph at GumGum. A graph in its typical sense is looking at a visualization of data. Now, when we think about a graph within GumGum, what we have here is a variety of different data points that you'd either call nodes or you'd call objects. Now, in this world, we're thinking about this being a context or a creative. And in most businesses across this industry, these nodes, these aspects of data, they'll sit very independently, siloed from one another. And what you then really struggle with is understanding the why and the how you can use this better in order to inform what you're doing, to drive better outcomes, and fundamentally start to drive some understanding of predictions. Now, what the Mindset Graph does is we start to understand the relationship between these nodes and how they coexist. So the relationship that we really talk about within the Mindset Graph is, as I said, this will be a context or it'll be creative. And what we're then looking to do is identify actually an audience or an attention index and how highly that index looks in order to understand the relationship between the two. So what we're then looking to identify is, does creative A index really highly for context B? And what we can then start to decipher is an understanding again of that relationship. So when we're thinking about this in practical terms, if a brand is coming to me and they're talking to me about, right, I've got X audience that I that I want to target against, this is the industry vertical that I'm working within, I can start to understand actually within a predictive sense where we expect or where we see those types of audiences indexing very highly for certain levels of context or certain types of context and start to build out a targeting strategy accordingly for them.
So you can, sorry, I'm going to interject questions here and cause more drawing to happen probably. So you can use this graph to match against a brand or a buyer's audience needs. So they could come to you and say, this is the type of people that we think we want to be targeting, but we don't necessarily understand everything there is to know about how relevant this advertising is going to be to them. And that's when you can use this graph to identify some of those audience segments, but become a little more specific about what particular extra segments might work for them.
Yeah. Okay. So what we believe is that the Mindset Graph can power brands throughout the entirety of their life cycle or their planning process. So was going to draw it out. There's probably no point.
Go on.
I was just going to write discovery. So from a first port of call, the graph is enabling brands to discover new things about themselves.
Yeah.
So this is the graph in itself, but it's important to note the breadth of the data or the breadth of the open web that we're scanning in order to deliver on this data asset. So there is so much understanding here of a brand, their competitive set, the industry vertical that they're contained within. So what I'm subsequently able to do is enable brands to understand and discover more about themselves and the audiences that they want to reach. A really great example of some work that we've done exists with the likes of Boucheron, where really bizarrely we identified that they indexed extremely highly for beekeeping, which we're like, okay, very
interesting.
And a little further investigation, we found that actually the hobby of the 1%ers, much in line with David Beckham, apparently. Not a documentary I've seen.
Is he a beekeeper?
He's a beekeeper.
Wow, I didn't know that. Okay.
And probably aligns nicely with the Boucheron audience.
Yeah, right.
But all of a sudden we're there with this interesting nugget of information that they otherwise don't know about themselves. Another slightly on the other end of the spectrum information is that we were doing some digging into the finance industry, and strangely Truist as a brand was indexing really highly for divorce. Now, it's not an area that they work within, but a little bit of digging, a little bit of insight. Real Housewives of Atlanta, program that you might have, may or may not have frequented.
Yes. Not a regular watcher, but I am aware of it.
So two of their main characters within the show were getting divorced.
Yeah.
And actually Truist was helping to negotiate the sale of their house. So what, again, we found is that they're indexing very highly for a context in an area and audience that you would have never otherwise imagined. Now, look, we're not there going, Boucheron should spend everything in beekeeping and Truist get into Real Housewives of Atlanta. But the point being that, again, the huge amount of insight and discovery that we're able to do with brands is massive through this data asset. Then moving into the planning phase, so discovery, we want to enrich, empower them to understand more about audiences so that they can then go through that planning and activation process.
Yep.
Going into planning, yes, we want to take some of that data and insight and apply that to targeting.
Yep.
We might also still want to work to that sort of binary contextual example of automotive sits within the automotive industry, or if you're sponsoring a particular event, maybe you still want ownership of that. But where we really want to add in is a level of science and understanding around how context can be more readily applied in a slightly more scientific fashion.
Through the planning process.
Exactly. So, go through this phase, understand everything in the open web, then let's actually start to decipher what their audiences are looking at across the graph. And let's start to identify contexts and creative that we know are going to resonate with those audiences. Brands typically plan based on audiences, they don't plan based on context.
Yeah.
And for us, it's how we can transcribe those audiences into context by taking first and third party data assets, plugging them into the graph and looking at how they overlap and creating an index in order to subsequently build predictive models around how we're going to find the best performance.
Yep. So that leads me on to another question then that I was going to ask, because you've mentioned how the mindset graph brings together already your contextual capabilities, your attention capabilities, and your creative capabilities. And you've just mentioned data there. So how do you use the platform to enhance either data sets that you might be able to provide clients or data sets that clients can bring to you?
Yeah,
of course. While you're explaining that, I'm going to write discovery, and then what did we say after that? Planning.
I was going to do this, but your writing is so much nicer than mine.
Discovery,
planning, activation.
Yeah.
And then really reporting. We can talk about that afterwards.
Yeah, right.
But look, in terms of this and how it kind of comes to life, the data asset, the graph, the data structure in itself is, of course, what underpins everything that we do. So it kind of, sits in the background.
Yep.
We do have a portal, which is fundamentally a visualization of this data asset. So that sits within everything that we do ourselves. We're also, so when clients work with us, they get aspects of data from the graph that we feed into them. We're giving access to the graph at the moment in a little bit of a closed beta phase, which is exciting.
Okay.
So currently working
with some existing clients.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Working with a number of agencies and advertisers to get feedback on how they like that data. The other element is potentially plugging this data in through an API into existing data assets.
Yeah.
So seeing how the graph in itself can empower, enrich other data assets to further the discovery, the planning processes for a variety of different businesses.
And so from a visual point of view, would you say the graph kind of sits here, it brings together these component functions of your platform. It sits sort of, in totality as a new product.
Yeah.
It produces some data itself, so there is an output to it, and then it can also be used for data enhancement on either side. So it's sort of like the graph sits in the middle, the data is kind of a circle around the outside. Would that be a neat way of explaining it visually?
I think that's a very neat way of explaining it. And look, what we're really trying to get to here through the discovery and the planning process is understanding sort of what we term as reach and relevance. So where can I reach your audience at scale, but where at the same time can I reach them in an area where that message is going to resonate with them, so that relevance aspect.
Yeah.
So, we want to, of course, drive high performance media, but if you're only reaching a very small portion of your audience, then you're not going to see particularly significant results. And vice versa, if I get mass reach, but relevance isn't very high, it's not going to be very performant. So, we need to match those two things together. And we believe the graph, by being able to understand the volume of context, but also where it's going to perform best, is able to bring in those predictive models in order to identify where reach and relevance is going to be maximized.
Totally makes sense. I'm going to write data down here and draw a circle around the whole thing. And then I feel
I love this. You're taking over the board for me.
Exactly. So Pete, tell me a little bit more about the technical detail behind how the nodes are created and the sort of interface with the data layer as well.
Of course. So it's a really great question. As I said, sort of GumGum's always been underpinned by particularly contextual data, and we built our own data or contextual capabilities from the ground up. Now, what that is powered by is a combination of natural language processing and computer vision, which enables us to understand everything that is being talked about within the text, understand what the imagery is on a page, but also we can apply that to video content, understanding what's been talked about and analyzing the image on a frame-by-frame basis. Now, from a contextual analysis standpoint, of course, that gives us an extremely granular view of the content. We're MRC accredited for content level verification. We feel like we've got the rubber stamp, the gold standard for context, which is great.
Yeah.
Broadly across the open web, so we're scanning and understanding a flipping
whole
load
bunch
of
content.
context.
Yeah.
Exactly. Then from a creative standpoint, we're applying that same technology. So natural language processing, computer vision. What color was the ad? What was the imagery within there? Was it a picture of a male or a female? What was the call to action? Moving from context into creative, fundamentally this is using the same technology. So it's still natural language processing and it is still computer vision. The distinction is that we're using that technology to understand and analyze everything that's contained within the creative. The color, the call to action, was it a picture of a male or a female? Was it a dog or a cat? And being able to categorize that accordingly. Now, what we then have is a huge repository of information around, yes, the open web and the context of that, but also a huge repository of creative performance.
Yeah.
Now, as I talked about earlier, the connection between that is then looking at attention. So we acquired a business, as I mentioned earlier, called Playground XYZ. So we have our own eye tracking panel. So we're scanning and understanding eye gaze. And then we're building predictive models with regards to how much attention is being given to different campaigns and context and creative. So that really creates the connectivity between those nodes in order for us to build that understanding of relationship and predictive models that we're going to apply to everything that we subsequently do for clients.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Pete. It was great to have you. Brilliant. And that was this episode of TraderTalk TV.